The morning mist clung to the Cascade Mountains like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, as 16-year-old Marcus Caldwell adjusted his backpack straps one final time. The October air bit at his exposed skin, carrying the scent of pine needles and the promise of an early winter. His parents, David and Linda Caldwell, watched from the trailhead parking lot of Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington state, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "You sure you don't want us to hike with you?" Linda called out, her voice carrying a mother's natural worry. She pulled her fleece jacket tighter around herself, dark hair escaping from beneath her knit cap. Marcus turned back with that confident smile that had been his trademark since childhood. "Mom, I've done this trail a dozen times. I'll be back before dark, I promise." He held up his phone, showing the GPS coordinates he'd programmed. "Besides, I need some time to think about the college applications." David stepped forward, placing a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. "Just stick to the marked trails, okay? Weather's supposed to turn later today." As a park ranger himself, David knew these mountains better than most, but that knowledge only heightened his awareness of their dangers. If you're following this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with what would become one of the most baffling disappearance cases in Pacific Northwest history. Marcus nodded, shouldering his pack with practiced ease. At 6 feet tall, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's determined chin, he cut an impressive figure against the towering evergreens. He'd been hiking these trails since he could walk, had earned his Eagle Scout badge on these very paths. The family had moved to Bellingham from Phoenix when Marcus was 8, drawn by David's job opportunity and the promise of a different kind of life among the mountains and forests of Washington state. "I love you both," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "See you tonight for Mom's famous chili." They watched him disappear around the first bend of the Heather Meadows Trail, his red jacket a bright spot against the muted greens and browns of the forest. It was 8:47 a.m. on October 15, 2013. It would be the last time anyone would see Marcus Caldwell for exactly 10 years, 3 months, and 12 days. The first hint of trouble came at sunset. Linda had spent the afternoon preparing Marcus's favorite meal, humming softly as she chopped onions and browned ground beef. The kitchen windows faced west, offering a perfect view of the mountains where her son was spending his day. As the sky deepened from orange to purple, she found herself glancing at the clock more frequently. "He should be back by now," she murmured to David, who was grading papers at the kitchen table. As a high school history teacher, David often brought work home, but tonight his concentration kept drifting to the empty driveway outside. "You know how he gets when he's thinking," David replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably found a good spot to sit and lost track of time." By 9 p.m., both parents were standing at the window, their dinner growing cold on the table behind them. Marcus's phone had gone straight to voicemail since 7, and the weather had indeed turned as predicted. Rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, and the wind had picked up, sending branches scraping against the siding. "I'm calling the ranger station," David announced, his professional calm cracking slightly. He knew the protocols, knew that 18 hours was the standard wait time for missing hikers, but this was his son. The search began at first light the next morning. David led a team of fellow park rangers, while Linda coordinated with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office from the makeshift command post they'd established in the parking lot. The rain had continued through the night, washing away footprints and making the trails treacherous. Search and rescue teams deployed with dogs, trained to follow scent trails, but the weather had eliminated most traces. "We found his car," Deputy Janet Rodriguez announced around noon, jogging back to the command post with mud-stained boots and concern etched across her features. "Key still in it? Wallet in the glove compartment?" Everything looks normal. Linda's hands shook as she accepted the plastic evidence bag containing Marcus's familiar leather wallet. Inside, she could see his driver's license photo. That same confident smile, those bright green eyes inherited from her side of the family. His debit card showed a purchase at the local gas station the morning before, buying the energy bars he always carried on hikes. The days blended into a nightmare of false hopes and crushing disappointments. Helicopter searches covered thousands of acres. Volunteers from the community joined professional search teams, and Marcus's story made regional news. His photo appeared on missing person flyers throughout the Pacific Northwest. A handsome teenager with an easy smile and dreams of studying environmental science at the University of Washington. 3 weeks into the search, they found his backpack. A volunteer searcher discovered it wedged between 2 fallen logs near Bagley Creek, approximately 3 miles from where Marcus had begun his hike. The pack was intact, but empty of most contents. His water bottles were gone, along with his food supplies and emergency gear. Strangely, his expensive camera remained inside, undamaged, and containing photos from earlier in his hike. Images of mountain vistas, wildlife, and one final selfie taken at what appeared to be a scenic overlook. "The forensics team is processing everything," Deputy Rodriguez explained to the grieving parents. "But there's no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate foul play. It's as if he just vanished." The official search was suspended after 6 weeks, though David continued leading volunteer efforts every weekend for months. Winter set in early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow that would hide any remaining clues until spring. The family hired private investigators, consulted psychics despite their skepticism, and followed up on every reported sighting from Vancouver to Portland. Christmas came and went in a haze of grief and desperate hope. Marcus's presents remained wrapped under the tree until Valentine's Day, when Linda finally broke down and donated them to charity. The house felt hollow, filled with the echo of a laugh they might never hear again, and footsteps that no longer thundered down the stairs each morning. The first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips, most proving to be well-meaning but ultimately fruitless. A documentary crew spent a week in Bellingham, interviewing friends, family, and search team members. They recreated Marcus's planned route using GPS data and explored various theories, from accidental falls into hidden ravines to the possibility that he'd chosen to disappear voluntarily, though everyone who knew him dismissed that notion immediately. Marcus wasn't running from anything, his best friend Tyler Brennan told the cameras. He was excited about college, about his future. He talked constantly about wanting to work for the National Park Service, like his dad. This wasn't someone looking to escape his life. As the second anniversary approached, the Caldwells had reluctantly begun the process of having Marcus declared legally dead. The decision tore at Linda's heart, but the practicalities of life demanded it. College funds needed to be handled, insurance policies required resolution, and their own healing needed to begin in earnest. David had taken early retirement from the Park Service, unable to return to the mountains that had claimed his son. He found work as a substitute teacher, grateful for the distraction, but never quite able to concentrate fully on lesson plans or student questions. Linda threw herself into volunteer work with missing children organizations, becoming a fierce advocate for families facing similar nightmares. The third anniversary passed quietly, marked only by a small memorial service at their local church and a renewed plea for information on social media. The case had long since grown cold in official terms, though it remained open, and Deputy Rodriguez, now promoted to detective, still fielded the occasional tip or supposed sighting. Years 4 and 5 brought a kind of numb acceptance. The Caldwells learned to navigate conversations that inevitably turned to their loss. mastered the art of changing subjects when well-meaning friends asked if there had been any news. They sold the house in Bellingham and moved to Spokane, seeking a fresh start in a place that didn't hold memories of Marcus in every corner store and familiar trail. By year 7, Linda had returned to school, earning a degree in social work and specializing in family crisis counseling. She found purpose in helping others navigate the particular hell of ambiguous loss, that unique grief that comes when there's no body to bury, no clear answer to cling to, just an endless question mark that shapes every holiday and anniversary. David eventually found his way back to teaching full-time, drawn to working with at-risk youth who reminded him daily that every teenager was someone's Marcus, someone's most precious thing in the world. He sponsored a hiking club at his new school, though he never personally returned to the mountains that had been his lifelong passion. The 8th and 9th anniversaries came and went with barely a mention in local media. Missing person cases, no matter how compelling initially, eventually fade from public consciousness. New tragedies capture attention, and the world moves forward while families remain frozen in time, waiting for answers that may never come. By the 10th anniversary, the Caldwells had built new lives around the Marcus-shaped hole in their hearts. They'd learned to speak of him in past tense, to smile at memories instead of drowning in them, to find meaning in the time they'd had, rather than focusing solely on what had been taken away. They'd never stopped hoping, but hope had evolved into something quieter, more sustainable, a candle flame rather than a bonfire. Which is why the phone call on January 27, 2024, shattered their carefully reconstructed world like a stone through glass. Detective Rodriguez's voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of disbelief that made Linda's knees buckle. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to sit down. We've received a call from the Portland Police Bureau. They have a man in custody who claims to be Marcus. He has no identification, but he knows details about the case that haven't been made public. I need you and David to prepare yourselves. This could be genuine, or it could be another false lead, but either way, you need to know." The drive to Portland took 4 hours that felt like 4 lifetimes. Linda sat rigid in the passenger seat, alternating between wild hope and protective skepticism. They'd received dozens of false leads over the years, people seeking attention, individuals with mental health issues, even a few cruel hoaxes that had reopened wounds just beginning to heal. "What if it really is him?" Linda whispered as they crossed the Columbia River. "What if he's been alive all this time? Where has he been? Why didn't he come home?" David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Let's just take this one step at a time. We'll know soon enough." The Portland Police Bureau's central precinct buzzed with activity as they were escorted through a maze of corridors to a small conference room. Detective Maria Santos, a slight woman with kind eyes and graying temples, met them at the door. "Before we go any further," Detective Santos said gently, "I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. The man we have in custody appears to be in his mid-20s, approximately the right age if your son had continued aging normally. But he's been living rough for some time, and he seems confused about certain details. He insisted we contact you, and he knew your names, your address in Bellingham, even your anniversary date. Through a one-way window, they saw him before he saw them. A young man sat at a metal table, his hands folded calmly in his lap. His hair was longer than Marcus had ever worn it, dark brown and unkempt. His face was thinner, marked by sun exposure and what looked like old scars along his jawline. But the profile, the way he held his shoulders, the distinctive shape of his hands, Linda gasped and grabbed David's arm. "It's him," she whispered. "Oh my God, David, it's really him." But as the young man turned toward the window, as if sensing their presence, both parents felt their certainty waver. The eyes were the right color, that distinctive green that Marcus had inherited from Linda's family. But there was something different about them, something guarded and distant that their open-hearted son had never possessed. "We'll need DNA confirmation, of course," Detective Santos explained. "But we wanted you to see him first, to hear what he has to say. Are you ready?" The reunion that followed defied every scenario Linda had imagined during 10 years of hoping. The young man looked up as they entered the room, and his face broke into a smile that was heartbreakingly familiar, yet somehow wrong. He stood slowly, as if unsure of his reception. "Mom. Dad." His voice was deeper than Marcus's had been at 16, roughened by time and circumstances they couldn't yet imagine. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long." Linda rushed forward, enveloping him in the hug she'd dreamed of for a decade. He felt real, solid, warm, but also strange. He was taller than Marcus had been, broader through the chest, and when she pulled back to look at his face, she noticed details that stopped her breath. A small scar through his left eyebrow, a tattoo visible at his collar. Marcus had been terrified of needles, calluses on his hands that spoke of hard physical labor. "Where have you been?" David asked, his voice breaking. "Son, where have you been all this time?" The young man, Marcus, it had to be Marcus, looked between his parents with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "I've been in Nevada," he said simply, "working on a ranch outside of Reno. I couldn't come home, not until now." Over the next several hours, sitting in that sterile conference room, with detectives taking notes and recording every word, they heard a story that raised more questions than it answered. Marcus claimed he'd suffered a fall during his hike, tumbling down a ravine and hitting his head on rocks. When he came to, he said, he was disoriented and wandering, eventually making his way to a highway where a trucker picked him up. "I didn't remember who I was at first," he explained, his hands fidgeting with a paper cup of coffee. "The trucker, his name was Earl. He was heading to Nevada for work. I went with him because I didn't know what else to do. By the time my memory started coming back, I was scared. I'd been gone so long, I thought you'd moved on, thought maybe it was better if I stayed away." The story had holes large enough to drive a truck through. How had he survived in the wilderness before reaching the highway? Why hadn't any of the massive search efforts found evidence of his fall? How had he obtained work without identification? And most troubling of all, why did his own parents feel like they were talking to a stranger? Linda wanted desperately to believe, to accept this miracle and begin rebuilding their family. But maternal instinct warred with hope. As she studied the face that looked so much like her son's, yet somehow wasn't quite right. The way he held his coffee cup was wrong. Marcus had been left-handed, but this young man favored his right. His laugh, when it came, was pitched differently. Even his posture seemed foreign. David's skepticism was more pronounced. As a man who'd spent his career dealing with evidence and protocols, he couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. "You said you remember falling," he pressed gently. "But search teams covered every inch of that area. We found your backpack 3 miles from the trailhead, but there was no ravine nearby deep enough for the kind of fall you're describing." "I don't remember everything clearly," Marcus replied, and there was something almost rehearsed about his response. "Head injuries can cause memory problems, right? I just know I woke up in pain, confused, and somehow I ended up on that highway." The DNA results took 3 agonizing days. Linda spent the time alternating between joy and doubt, cooking Marcus's favorite foods and watching him eat them with apparent pleasure, though she couldn't shake the feeling that his reactions were somehow performed rather than genuine. He answered questions about his childhood, his friends, his plans for college, but his responses felt careful, as if he were drawing from studied information rather than lived experience. When Detective Santos called with the results, her voice carried a heaviness that made Linda's heart sink before she spoke the words. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "The DNA is not a match. The young man in our custody is not Marcus Caldwell. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Linda collapsed into David's arms, sobbing not just for the loss of this false hope, but for having to lose Marcus all over again. The young man who had called himself their son sat quietly as Detective Santos explained that he would be charged with filing a false police report and potentially identity theft, depending on what further investigation revealed. "Why?" Linda asked him through her tears as they prepared to leave. "Why would you do this to us? Why would you pretend to be our son?" For the first time since they'd met him, the young man's careful composure cracked. His shoulders sagged, and genuine emotion flickered across features that had seemed so familiar just hours before. "Because I wanted a family," he said quietly. "I've been nobody for so long, and when I heard about your son on some missing person website, I thought maybe I could give you what you wanted and find a place where I belonged. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." An investigation revealed his real identity. James Anthony Russo, 26 years old, originally from Cleveland. He'd aged out of the foster care system at 18 with no family connections and had been living transient for years, picking up work where he could find it and moving on when circumstances forced him to. He'd spent months researching the Caldwell case, studying newspaper articles and social media posts to construct his false identity. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but Linda found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the young man who'd been so desperate for belonging that he'd convinced himself this deception could somehow work. In counseling sessions afterward, she would explore why she'd wanted so badly to believe him, despite the obvious inconsistencies, the way grief could make people vulnerable to false hope, the powerful need to believe in miracles when reality had proved too harsh to bear. But even as they dealt with the aftermath of this elaborate deception, neither Linda nor David could shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. The case was back in the news. Marcus's photo was circulating again, and tips were pouring in from across the country. Most would prove worthless, as they always had, but Detective Rodriguez had assured them that every lead would be thoroughly investigated. 3 weeks after the Portland incident, as the media attention was finally dying down, Linda's phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. She recognized Detective Rodriguez's number and answered with the weary resignation of someone who'd received too many disappointing calls over the years. "Linda, I need you to listen carefully," Rodriguez said, and there was something different in her voice, an excitement barely held in check. "We just received a call from the FBI. They've been tracking a human trafficking ring that operated along the Canadian border 10 years ago. They have someone in custody who's provided information about American teenagers who were taken during that time period." Marcus's name came up. Linda felt the world tilt around her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we may finally have answers, real answers this time. The FBI wants to interview you and David as soon as possible. There's a chance, a real chance, that Marcus is still alive. To be. The FBI field office in Seattle occupied an entire floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, its sterile corridors a sharp contrast to the small-town police stations where the Caldwells had spent so much time over the years. Special Agent Catherine Walsh was a compact woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen humanity at its worst and somehow maintained her faith in justice. "What I'm about to tell you is difficult," Agent Walsh began, as they settled into a conference room overlooking Elliott Bay. "We've been tracking an international human trafficking network for the past 3 years. The operation moved people across the Canadian border, primarily targeting young adults who seemed vulnerable or isolated. Hikers, backpackers, people traveling alone." David's face had gone pale. "Are you saying Marcus was kidnapped?" "It's a strong possibility," Walsh replied carefully. The suspect in custody, Alexander Petrov, was arrested in connection with trafficking operations in British Columbia. When we showed him photos of missing persons from that time period, he identified several individuals, including Marcus. According to Petrov, your son wasn't taken randomly. He was specifically targeted because someone had been watching him, tracking his hiking patterns. Linda felt sick. The idea that someone had been stalking Marcus, studying his routines, planning his abduction, while she'd worried about nothing more dangerous than twisted ankles and bad weather. It was a violation beyond comprehension. Petrov claims Marcus was taken to a remote camp in northern British Columbia, Walsh continued. The operation used American teenagers for labor in illegal logging operations, knowing they'd be too far from home and too scared to try to escape. According to his testimony, Marcus was there for approximately 2 years before the camp was abandoned. 2 years? Linda whispered. What happened after that? That's where the trail gets complicated. Petrov lost track of individuals after the camp closed. Some were moved to other operations, others were simply released with threats to keep them quiet. But he believes Marcus might have been among a group that was relocated to operations in the American Southwest. The next several days passed in a blur of interviews, legal procedures, and agonizing hope tempered by the knowledge that Petrov might be lying to reduce his own sentence. Other families were contacted, parents of teenagers who disappeared during hiking trips or backpacking adventures along the northern border. A pattern emerged of young people vanishing without a trace, their disappearances attributed to wilderness accidents when the truth might have been far more sinister. Agent Walsh arranged for the Caldwells to speak with other parents whose children had been identified by Petrov. The conversations were heartbreaking and hopeful in equal measure. Families who'd spent years believing their children were dead now faced the possibility that they might be alive but traumatized, scattered across North America, possibly too afraid or ashamed to come forward. The psychological impact of this kind of exploitation is severe, explained Dr. Jennifer Harrison, the FBI's consulting psychologist. Victims often develop complex survival mechanisms that can make reconnection with their previous lives extremely difficult. Even if we locate Marcus, he may not be the same person you remember. Linda understood the warning, but refused to let it diminish her hope. After 10 years of not knowing, any answer was better than the endless uncertainty that had defined their lives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A social worker in Phoenix named Rebecca Martinez had been following the news coverage of the trafficking ring with growing certainty. She worked with a residential program for young adults transitioning out of homelessness, and one of her clients had always reminded her of the missing teenager whose story had captivated the Pacific Northwest a decade earlier. I probably shouldn't be calling, Martinez admitted when she reached Agent Walsh. Client confidentiality and all that. But I've been working with someone for about 8 years now, ever since he showed up at a shelter in Phoenix with no ID and severe PTSD. He's never talked about his past, but the physical description matches perfectly, and Agent Walsh, his name is Mark. Mark, not Marcus, but close enough to be a variation someone might adopt if they were trying to hide their true identity while maintaining some connection to who they'd been. Within hours, Agent Walsh and Detective Rodriguez were on a plane to Phoenix. The Caldwells wanted desperately to come along, but Walsh advised against it. If this is Marcus, he spent years building defenses to survive trauma, she explained. The shock of seeing you might be overwhelming. Let us make initial contact, assess his mental state, and then we'll determine the best way to proceed. The residential facility occupied a converted motel on the outskirts of Phoenix, its cheerful desert landscaping and fresh paint doing little to disguise the fact that its residents had nowhere else to go. Rebecca Martinez met the investigators in her cramped office, her desk covered with case files and coffee-stained reports. Mark Collins, That's the name he gave us, she explained. He's 26 now, been with our program longer than almost anyone else. He works part-time at a warehouse, keeps to himself mostly, but he's reliable and kind. The other residents respect him. She pulled out a thick file filled with notes, medical reports, and program evaluations. When he first came to us, he had severe panic attacks, night terrors, and couldn't handle being in enclosed spaces. Classic signs of trauma. He's made remarkable progress, but he's never talked about his life before Phoenix. We assumed he was a runaway, maybe escaping an abusive family situation. Has he ever mentioned hiking, the mountains, anything about Washington State? Detective Rodriguez asked. Martinez shook her head. That's what's interesting. For someone who clearly spent time outdoors, he has scars consistent with exposure and rough living. He avoids nature completely, won't even walk through the small garden we have here. It's like he's afraid of open spaces. Through the window of the facility's common room, they watched him before making contact. Mark Collins sat alone at a corner table, reading a paperback novel, and occasionally glancing up at a television where other residents watched a game show. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent significant time in the sun. His hair was dark brown, longer than Marcus had worn it, and his face was marked by small scars that suggested a hard life lived outdoors. But even from a distance, even accounting for 10 years of aging and obvious hardship, the resemblance to Marcus Caldwell was unmistakable. Agent Walsh approached slowly, her credentials visible, but her demeanor casual. Mark, I'm Agent Walsh with the FBI. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes. The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. Mark's entire body tensed, his eyes darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and his hands began to shake. I haven't done anything wrong, he said quietly. I've been clean. I have a job. I follow all the program rules. You're not in any trouble, Walsh assured him gently. I just need to ask you some questions about your past. It's okay if you don't remember everything. I understand that can be difficult. Over the next hour, sitting in a quiet corner of the common room with Rebecca Martinez nearby for support, a story emerged that was both horrific and hopeful. Mark's memories of his life before Phoenix were fragmented, filled with gaps that might have been caused by trauma, substance abuse used to cope with that trauma, or simple self-preservation. He remembered being taken while hiking, though details were vague. Men with accents who spoke a language he didn't understand. A long drive to somewhere cold and mountainous, where he was forced to work in forests, cutting trees under armed guard. Years of moving from place to place, always kept with other young people who'd been taken from their families. Sometimes I dream about a woman with dark hair, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She's calling my name, but it's not Mark. It's something else, something longer. And there's a man with her, tall like me, with kind eyes. But when I try to remember more, it hurts too much. Agent Walsh felt her pulse quicken. The woman in your dreams, can you see her face clearly? Mark closed his eyes, concentrating. She has green eyes, like mine, and she smells like vanilla and coffee. She's always wearing a blue sweater, and she's worried about something. About me, I think. Linda had indeed worn a blue sweater the morning Marcus left for his hike, his favorite, one he'd given her for Mother's Day years earlier. And her perfume, her coffee habit, the way worry always showed in her green eyes. These were details that wouldn't have appeared in any news coverage. Mark, Walsh said gently, I think those people in your dreams might be your parents. Your real parents, who've been looking for you for 10 years. The DNA test took 24 hours to process, but this time, Agent Walsh felt confident even before the results arrived. Mark's reaction to photos of the Caldwell family, his knowledge of details that had never been made public, and most convincingly, his emotional response to hearing Marcus's full name, Marcus David Caldwell, left little doubt about his identity. "I remember now," he said, tears streaming down his face as he stared at a photo of his 16-year-old self. "I remember being excited about college applications. I remember my dad teaching me to read trail markers. I remember my mum making chili and worrying about everything." He looked up at Agent Walsh with a mixture of wonder and terror. Are they still alive? Do they still live in the same house? When the DNA results confirmed what everyone already knew, that Mark Collins was indeed Marcus David Caldwell, Agent Walsh faced the delicate task of reuniting a family that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. Marcus was fragile, still processing memories that were returning in waves, still struggling with the psychological aftermath of years of captivity and exploitation. "I need you to understand," Dr. Harrison explained to Linda and David during a video call. "Marcus has survived by compartmentalizing his past, by becoming someone else. The process of reconnection will be gradual and potentially difficult for all of you. He may not be the son you remember." But Linda didn't care about difficulty. She didn't care if Marcus was different, damaged, or forever changed by his experiences. He was alive, and after 10 years of not knowing, that was miracle enough. The reunion took place in Phoenix, in a therapy office designed for family counseling sessions. Linda had spent the flight memorizing every detail of the most recent photos Agent Walsh had shared, trying to reconcile the weathered young man with the bright-eyed teenager who'd walked into the mountains a decade earlier. When Marcus, she would always think of him as Marcus, entered the room, Linda's breath caught in her throat. He moved differently than he had as a teenager, more cautiously, with the wariness of someone who'd learned that the world could be dangerous in ways most people never imagined. But his eyes, those distinctive green eyes, were unmistakably her son's. "Mom?" he said tentatively, as if testing the word. Linda nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat. Marcus took a step forward, then another, and then they were embracing with a desperation born of 10 years of separation and the knowledge of how easily they might never have found each other again. David joined them, wrapping his arms around both his wife and his son, and for long minutes they simply held each other while tears fell and words proved inadequate to express the magnitude of what they'd all endured and survived. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Marcus would need extensive therapy to process his trauma and readjust to a world where he was free to make his own choices. The Caldwells would need to learn how to be a family again, how to navigate the complex emotions of reunion after such devastating loss. There would be legal proceedings as the FBI continued building cases against the trafficking network, and Marcus would need to testify about experiences he'd spent years trying to forget. But as they sat together in that small therapy office, watching the desert sun set through bulletproof windows, none of that mattered. They were together again, imperfect and changed, but whole in the ways that counted most. Marcus was home, not just geographically but emotionally, ready to begin the long process of reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. 6 months later, Marcus Caldwell enrolled in community college in Spokane, choosing to study social work with a focus on helping other trafficking survivors. He still struggled with crowds and enclosed spaces, still woke sometimes from nightmares about forests and armed guards, but he also laughed again, tentatively at first, and then with increasing frequency. He learned to trust again, to hope again, to believe in futures that extended beyond mere survival. His story became a beacon of hope for other families of missing persons, proof that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible could happen. The boy who'd disappeared in the mountains had indeed returned, not unchanged, but unbroken, ready to help others find their way home from whatever wilderness had claimed them. And every morning, as he studied at the kitchen table while Linda made coffee and David graded papers, Marcus was reminded that some journeys, no matter how dark or difficult, eventually lead back to love.